In my 30-year career writing TV, one of the episodes that is still considered the most successful thing I ever wrote, it's Lemon of Troy, an episode of The Simpsons that I wrote in 1995. What was the secret of this story? Well, I can tell you what I figured out at The Simpsons very early on was that every single episode of that show centered around one character in contrast with another character. Every A story was something like Homer versus Marge, and the B story would be Lisa versus Bart. And then the next episode would be Homer versus Krusty the Clown, and the B story would be Bart versus Grandpa. It was always combinations of characters in conflict. And what I figured out as a young writer on that show was there were combinations which had never been done. So the first episode that I pitched that I got assigned to write as a writer on the show was Homer versus Patty and Selma. I cleverly recognized that Homer's sisters-in-law, Patty and Selma, generally appeared as one character, and there had never been an episode fully devoted to Homer versus Patty and Selma. When I pitched that, I got my first episode, which is called Homer versus Patty and Selma. The next season, when it came time to pitch stories, I realized there was another combo which had never been done, and it was the town of Springfield versus the town of Shelbyville in a conflict. That had not been done, and when I pitched Lemon of Troy as a town versus town story, I was immediately assigned that story to write. I was hired as a writer on The Simpsons in 1995, and I really barely got that job. I had effectively had only one job in TV before that. That was as a sketch writer on a little-known show called The Ben Stiller Show. It was a sketch show on Fox. And that show was canceled after 12 episodes. I had a grand total of about 6 months in professional comedy writing. But the head writer of The Ben Stiller Show was a guy named Bob Odenkirk. He would later go on to be the actor playing Saul on Better Call Saul. At the time, Bob was just a very respected sketch writer. He had been a sketch writer on Saturday Night Live. When Bob was on Saturday Night Live, he had worked with Conan O'Brien. So this year, 1995, Conan O'Brien was a writer on The Simpsons who left to do his own talk show. I was a writer on The Ben Stiller Show that got canceled. Bob Odenkirk knew us both, and Bob recommended me to be a writer on Conan's new talk show. Now, when that happened, the head writer of The Simpsons, David Merkin, heard that Conan was hiring me and said, "Who's this kid, Brent Forrester? Bring him in for a meeting on The Simpsons," and said, rather than work on Conan's sure-to-fail talk show, why don't you work on this tried and true animated show called The Simpsons, which at this point was already in season 5. Of course, I bailed on Conan and went to The Simpsons, and that's how I arrived there. But I arrived there very green and naive. I did not know what I was doing on this show, and I had to learn very rapidly what the job was and how to do it. The job essentially had two components, and this is true of any sitcom. There was the job of punch-up, where you would sit in a room with 10 other writers and the script in your hand that we're working on this week, and you would just sit there page by page and try to punch up the jokes that were in the script, and that would be 10 a.m. till 10 p.m. every day. 12 hours a day, you would sit there and punch up jokes. That was the bulk of your job. The other part of your job, though, was writing episodes, getting your own episode assigned, being the author of a script. And that was what everybody wanted. And all the new young writers that were hired, we frothed with desire to get assigned a script. So I was trying to figure out as a young writer, how do you get assigned a script? And I had this great insight, which is applied for the rest of my career. I noticed that the episodes of The Simpsons always involved two characters in conflict. There would be an A story and a B story. In the A story, it would be Homer versus Marge, and in the B story, Bart versus Lisa. And then in the next week, it would be Marge versus Grandpa, and in the B story, Lisa versus Krusty. It would always be combinations of two characters in conflict that would be the A and the B story. And what I realized were there were some conflicts which had never been done. And so the first story that I pitched that got assigned to me as a writer was Homer versus his sisters-in-law, Patty and Selma. I was clever enough to recognize that Patty and Selma, although they were two characters, were always appearing together as if they were one. And so Homer versus Patty and Selma was an original conflict that had never been done before. When I pitched that, I was assigned a story for the first time. That was my first Simpsons episode. The next year, when it came time to pitch stories, I looked again for an original combination of characters in conflict that had never been done before. And I had this great insight, which is the characters in The Simpsons live in a town called Springfield, and there's a rival town next door called Shelbyville. Now, one combo that had never been done was a conflict between the town versus town. And so I thought, eureka, I'll pitch this as a conflict and get a story assigned. And that's how I pitched Lemon of Troy. It's a town versus town story. Now, the way the story assignment process worked on The Simpsons back in 1995, it's the same today. The season would begin with what was called the story conference. And all the writers and James L. Brooks, one of the creators of the show, would go to Shutter's Hotel in Santa Monica. And the entire penthouse suite of the hotel was rented out. And we would all show up and we would pitch stories, the writers, to James L. Brooks, the sort of father figure of the show. And all of the stories for the season would come out of that story conference. There would be elaborate food spread out on buffet tables, every kind of bagel and cream cheese. None of it would get eaten because all the writers were so nervous on story conference day where we would pitch. I remember pitching Lemon of Troy and having to rely on that oral storytelling process, especially at the beginning. So the way I pitched that story, I said, okay, we start with Bart is riding his bike down the street and he comes across wet cement. Now, as a fourth grader, there's nothing more irresistible than wet cement. Bart sees it. He realizes this is his chance at fame. He's going to write his name in the wet cement, and we do a fantasy sequence of him fantasizing thousands of years in the future where people look and go, who is this wonderful Bart Simpson who wrote his name in the cement?
Wet cement? Is there any sweeter sign? Well, maybe high voltage.
Hello, son. You want to try this flying motorcycle I just invented?
No time.
Okay.
This is for the ages.
Like Stonehenge, this site will forever be a mystery. Who was Bart? And how did he manage to write his name in solid cement?
He must have been much smarter than his sister Lisa, about whom we know nothing.
Say, let's bring him back to life by using technology.
Ay, caramba!
What's normal to him amazes us.
He will be our new god.
Oh, good, somebody's shadow. I'll just turn and brag about my work. Nice!
Bart, you've graffito tagged public property.
It was an accident.
Now, this is what we used to call in The Simpsons a set piece, an opening bit of comedy that would get you into the story and could be long and protracted scene of comedy in its own. The wet cement set piece is how I started out. Now we transitioned into the story. Bart gets caught. He gets busted. When he goes home, Marge gives him a lecture about why would you want to vandalize your own town, Bart? And she tells him all about the things you want to be proud of in your hometown, like the fishing hole where people get their fish, the Springfield Isotopes, our baseball team, which we're so proud of. Now we do a sequence where Bart walks through the town and sees the fishing hole and sees the Isotopes playing baseball. And it ends at the town lemon tree, where the kids get their lemons and they make lemonade, which is the core of the kids' economy in the town. Now, at this point, the way I pitched it was, the lemon tree in Springfield grows right on the borderline between Springfield and Shelbyville. The branches fall over into both sides of the town, and the lemons fall equally into Springfield and into Shelbyville. You can feel in the storytelling that now I'm kind of in the area of fable. It even feels almost like an Old Testament tale of a tree in the Garden of Eden. And it was very fun to lean into that feeling of fable, which is epic in scale when dealing with kids who are small in scale. So that was a core part of the energy and the entertainment of the story. The other element that was core to Lemon of Troy was a certain kind of actually grounded nostalgia in what it's like to be a kid. So for this element, I was really pulling, honestly, more from Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, which was, if you read the introduction to Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain's nostalgic reflection on what it's like to be a kid. That book had very much influenced me as a reader, and I was pulling on that energy in Lemon of Troy. I remembered being a kid and having a toy walkie-talkie, camouflage paint, all of these things which suggest, as a third grader or fourth grader, the idea of adventure that typically as a fourth grader you never have. Lemon of Troy was the fulfillment of that fourth grade energy of wanting to go on an epic adventure as a kid, and in this case, actually going on one, going into the other town on an adventure to get your lemon tree back. So the episode had two different energies: an epic energy, town versus town, a fable. It, as you know from the ending, pulls from the Trojan War. So it's got that epic feel here, but it's also got this grounded, emotional, nostalgic element of remembering what it's like to be a kid. Those two energies are what are at play there. Now, the stakes in the episode continually build as the episode goes on. It starts out with a conflict at the border between Bart and the Shelbyville Bart, the bad kid of Shelbyville, who in this border skirmish argues with Bart. They insult each other, and the bad kid eventually takes the tree into Shelbyville.
Springfield sucks! Hey, stop talking bad about my town, man.
Why don't you make me?
I don't make trash, I burn it.
Then I guess you're a garbage man.
Well, I know you are, but what am I?
So the stakes at first are personal. I hate that other kid. That's where the clash is. But the stakes grow as the episode goes on. The B story in this case is Homer and the dads getting in Flanders RV and going to look for their kids who've gone AWOL. As the dads enter into Shelbyville, they're mocked by the Shelbyville residents. Oh, you've lost your kids, say the Shelbyville residents. That's because you're so stupid. This is why we beat you in football almost 50% of the time. These kind of jokes are designed to get the dander up of the dads as they remember their own historic antagonism with the town next door. The stakes are further increased by this monologue given by Grandpa under the lemon tree, where he tells the history of this lemon tree and the history of the rivalry between these towns. There we get another, what we call set piece. Set pieces would always open a Simpsons episode. It would be a long comedy bit that would open the episode and then throw into the plot. But you could also do a set piece within the episode. An example of a set piece is in Lisa the Vegetarian, where at Lisa's school, they show a film made by the meat department all about why meat is great. That film we would call a set piece, a unit of comedy that stands on its own. Grandpa's lecture about the history of the lemon tree, in which we flash back and see the whole history of the rivalry between Springfield and Shelbyville, that's called a set piece. In this case, it's used for comedy, but it also is used to increase the stakes. This is why it's so important to get this tree back.
Did you know this tree dates back to frontier times? Shut up! It all began when Jebediah Springfield first came to these lands with his partner, Shelbyville Manhattan.
People, our search is over. On this site we shall build a new town, where we can worship freely, govern justly, and grow vast fields of hemp for making rope and blankets.
Yes, and marry our cousins.
What are you talking about, Shelbyville? Why would we want to marry our cousins?
Because they're so attractive. I thought that was the whole point of this journey.
Absolutely not.
I tell you, I won't live in a town that robs men of the right to marry their cousins.
Well, then we'll form our own town. Who will come and live a life devoted to chastity, abstinence, and a flavorless mush I call root marm?
The other element of this story that seemed to work so well was the use of setup and payoff as a way to increase your satisfaction as a viewer of the story. So there's two examples that come to mind here. One is the Roman numerals setup and payoff. So early on in the episode, I needed a moment where Bart feels trapped in class. That feeling that all of us can remember if you went to public school, where you're learning stuff that you are absolutely certain has no use in your life, and they're just wasting your time. And you so much at that point want to get out into the world of adventure. So I had Bart sitting in class, and he's learning about Roman numerals. What could be more useless to your life in the world than learning Roman numerals?
Those Shelbyville kids think they're so hot, but you know what? They're not. I really agree with you on this one, Bart.
Class, please. If you don't learn Roman numerals, you'll never know the dates certain motion pictures were copyrighted.
Everybody come quick! Something's happened! No time to explain!
No, children, no. Your education is important. Roman numerals, etc. Whatever. I tried.
Okay, the payoff to that setup is later when he's running from the bad kids from Shelbyville. He ends up in a zoo where there's a lion enclosure, and the only way to escape the door that will lead to safety, you have to know Roman numerals in order to get out.
Safe at last. Caution. Exit through door 7 only. All other rooms contain man-eating tigers. Roman numerals. They never even tried to teach us that in school.
That's an example of a setup and a payoff. The other big setup payoff moment is the ending. And the ending of this one is part of why people really like the episode. The ending of the episode, we get to what seems like a total dead end. The characters cannot solve the problem of the episode. They figured out where the lemon tree is, but they can't get it back. It's inside a tow truck yard, which is effectively a fortress with barbed wire around the top. They get there and they can't get in.
The tree! Oh.
Oh, a car impound lot. The impenetrable fortress of suburbia.
And they're mocked and they have to leave in defeat, and it feels like the end of the episode. But lo and behold, Bart has an idea. If they park their RV in a red zone, it'll get towed into the yard. They can creep out of the RV and steal the lemon tree back. Now, the whole episode, as I've said, has had this feeling of an epic tale. And so, of course, at the end, it feels very satisfying when they have an epic tale ending. Essentially, it's the Trojan horse coming into play in Springfield fashion as an RV to get the lemon tree. And then, of course, to highlight the point, I had Homer say, "No one in history has ever done anything this clever," spotlighting the fact that, of course, it was done before in the Trojan War.
No one in history has ever done anything this clever.
Now, that's another example of a setup and a payoff. The secret here, when you're trying to do this kind of ending, where it feels like a satisfying aha payoff moment, is you think of the ending first, and then you back engineer the pieces of exposition that need to go in to make that happen. So in this case, the real challenge was I had a contrivance. I knew that I had to get this lemon tree into a tow truck yard in order to get my Helen of Troy ending, the Trojan horse ending of the RV towed in there. But why would the lemon tree end up in a tow truck yard? Okay, here is where you have to disguise the contrivance. So I remember very well in the story conference how I pitched it. I said, okay, Bart in Springfield has a rival in Shelbyville. The rival is the meanest kid in Shelbyville. And the meanest kid in Shelbyville has the meanest dad in Shelbyville. And the meanest dad in Shelbyville has the meanest job in Shelbyville. It's tow truck driver. He has his own tow truck yard. So you can see in that way, I created the tow truck yard as a natural progression of the storytelling. But in fact, it was a way of disguising a necessary contrivance that made the ending work. In the end, the reason that this episode is successful, I think, is because it's pulling from two different kinds of energies. One is this epic tale played out in a small town that is finally the Trojan War. But it's also very small and grounded and Tom Sawyer-y in that nostalgia for what it's like to be a kid. The combo of those two things is finally what made it work. The greatest praise I ever got on this episode came from David Cohen, later David X. Cohen, who would create Futurama. He really loved one joke that I had in there where Bart is sitting with Milhouse and they're looking through binoculars, and Milhouse says to Bart, as Bart's looking at the other kids talking far away, Milhouse says, "Bart, I thought you said you could read lips." And Bart says, "I assumed I could."
What are they saying? I'm not sure. I thought you said you could read lips. I assumed I could.
David Cohen loved that joke. It's a very specific kind of joke. It's an observation of the way it used to feel like to be a kid when you made those kind of assumptions. And David Cohen said to me, this episode reminds me of what it was like to be a fourth grader. Highest praise you could possibly get for an episode of TV.